Welcome to Bible Reader Companion. Our Bible reading this week is the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the book of Jude, and Revelation chapters 1 and 2. Our memory verse this week is 3rd John chapter 1 and verse 4, which reads in the New King James Version, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." John talks a lot in these letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, about our walk and about our relationship with Christ and about what we need to do. And we want to look at a little bit more of that in 1 John chapter 2 and beginning in verse 1. 1 John 2, beginning in verse 1. "My little children, these things I write to you, so that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. And he himself is the propitiation for our sins, not for ours only, but also for the whole world. Now by this we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He who says, 'I know him,' and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. He who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk just as he walked." We looked at an interesting contrast in John's comments at the end of chapter 1, where he talks about the fact that we have to walk in light and not in darkness, so we may have fellowship with God in whom is no darkness. And yet John makes a contrast, and he says, well, it doesn't mean you have no sin. Anybody who claims not to have sin is a liar. John makes another interesting contrast here, in that he starts off by saying, "I write these things to you so that you don't sin. But if you do sin, you have an advocate with the Father." But then he turns around and says, as if to say, that's not an excuse for sin. That doesn't mean that we can say, hey, you know what? Jesus is our propitiation. He's our sacrifice. He's the one that restores our relationship with God. So you know what? I can go out here and I can live and walk however I want. No. So just as in chapter 1, walking with him and having a fellowship with him doesn't mean we never sin. By contrast, the fact that he will forgive us of our sin doesn't give us justification to walk in sin and say, hey, it's all good because Jesus will forgive me. We need to strive to walk as he walked. That's what he says in verse 6. He who abides in him ought himself to walk just as he walked. Did Jesus look for excuses to sin and to violate the will of God? Of course not. Jesus was perfect. He is that standard that we have to try to live up to. If we're going to walk as Jesus walked, what are we going to do? We're going to do everything we can not to sin. Now, when we sin, Jesus will provide that means by which we can be forgiven. But if we say, well, I know God, but I don't care about walking with him, I don't care about the fact about I have sin in my life, then we don't really know him. Those who don't keep his commandments, he says, I know him and doesn't keep his commandments, he's a liar. We don't know him. So the person who says, look, it's okay to be a Christian and just kind of live however you want, and God's grace will take care of it, they clearly haven't read. They haven't read Paul. They haven't read John, because John says, look, just because Jesus is your propitiation, just because he's your sacrifice, doesn't mean you can walk any old way you want to walk. You still have to walk in him. You still have to keep his commandments. You still have to keep his word. We do those things. We can have forgiveness. We can walk with God. We can be in the light and not the darkness, and we can be forgiven. And maybe we'll even bring joy to others when we do it. And that's what John said. He heard about people who were walking in the truth. And that brings about our memory verse, 3rd John chapter 1 and verse 4. "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." Let us think about that, and let us be people who walk in truth. Thank you for thinking on these things. We hope you'll join us again next week.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook for more content like this.